This is Xoai Pham, who is a Vietnamese trans person. She descends from a long legacy of warriors, healers, and shamans. Her life's work is in dreaming new futures where we are all limitless, and she makes those dreams a reality as a poet, an essayist, an editor, and a collaborative educator. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for making time.
Thank you for having me. I feel so gassed up the way that you said that bio.
Yeah, you're phenomenal, and I'm so happy that you're joining us. So how are you doing? How are things for you right now? Just tell us how you are.
Yeah, I am a little bit, I'm really grateful right now because I haven't lost any income and I'm actually pretty at peace in some ways. Like I've been really slowing down and folks in my life have really encouraged that from folks among my colleagues at Transgender Law Center and other workspaces, and then just my loved ones. And so I've been doing my best to kind of lean into that sort of stillness and find the lessons in it rather than kind of letting myself panic, because I think I can easily do that. So I'm doing pretty good. How are you, Connie?
Thank you for asking. I think I'm okay. Things are hectic, but I'm really excited about joining forces with people and hearing insights and learning from folks. So that's been really great. Thank you. So I know that you do so many things, and we asked you to join us to talk about, things that you wanted to talk about, actually. If you can do me a favor, I know that you work with the Transgender Law Center, you're an editor. Can you tell us what's going on with the specific communities that you work with and are a part of and love and take care of?
Yeah. So I am. I like to call myself the digital media sorceress at Transgender Law Center. I handle a lot of the digital media. I'm also an editor at Autostraddle, among a couple other things that I do. And so right now, what I'm noticing is that there has been a heightened experience of violence and suffering from trans communities, especially trans communities who are living in the South, who are living with HIV, who are disabled, specifically folks who are furthest in the margins. I think that for a lot of people, the experience of this pandemic has been unprecedented. That word has been used continuously and repeatedly, and I don't want people to get the experience of trans people wrong. For folks who I mentioned, this pandemic has only added another layer of state violence. And there is a difference between the virus and the pandemic, right? The pandemic is either propelled or it is averted by the actions of individuals and governments. And what we've witnessed over the past few months is that individuals with privilege and governments with immense power have chosen to ignore the signs of the pandemic until people were dying in mass. And so for me, blood is on the hands of these specific individuals and governments. I want to name specifically trans people who are in detention right now, trans migrants who are incarcerated in migrant prisons. These trans people in detention have no choice but to social distance. They can't choose to just buy a face mask and buy gloves. There are trans disabled people who can't just fall back on healthcare if they get sick. They can't just be careless with how they are treating themselves in this time, because hospitals and providers are picking and choosing who lives and who dies. And disabled people, especially trans disabled people, have always been told that their lives are disposable. And then trans people living with HIV have lived through a time like this where it's not as unprecedented in that, there are trans people who have lived through the peak of the AIDS crisis, which is still a crisis today. And I noticed that there still are very few people and organizations who are looking to the wisdom of trans people living with HIV. So I'm seeing a lot of increased fear of death, and it's a really real situation, right? I think that for a lot of people, the way that people are confronting their mortality right now is even more is even more present in trans communities, and that's been causing a lot of panic and fear. Um, but I also want to name that trans people have always been spearheading solutions that transform our world. And those solutions that we spearheaded existed before this pandemic, right? And only now people are only beginning to look to trans communities for those dreams and visions. Um, and I think that people are also reckoning with what they lost because they were ignoring those dreams that trans people have dreamt up, because they've been taught to be comfortable with the normalcy that we had that's filled with injustice and pain.
Mm-hmm. I really, so thank you for sharing the breadth of that information. It's a lot to,
Mm-hmm.
it's a lot to absorb, let alone to live through or to try to survive under, right? So,
Yeah.
um, because because there's so much, I just want to make sure that we clarify and kind of name things a little bit more, right? So you've highlighted that for trans communities, this is not unprecedented, specifically for folks who are disabled, folks who have HIV, folks who are incarcerated, who don't have the ability or even who cannot socially distance, who are also impacted by state violence on top of the virus. Am I hearing that correctly?
That's right.
Okay. And then I also hear you saying that there is a lot of fear that is on top of surviving state violence, on top of the virus. So that's a part of surviving, is to account for the fear
Mm-hmm.
and the worry around death. Right. So I hear that. And I just want to make sure that our listeners and our people who are watching, folks who are watching, that they are attuned to what you're saying. So I want to amplify that. And then I also hear you beautifully reminding us that trans communities have been envisioning futures, envisioning present time in ways that folks have neglected. And so we should continue, even though some of us are new to amplifying trans leadership. You're saying that trans folks have always been dreaming and living a different reality, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
that, am I hearing that correctly? Because I heard
Yeah,
it so
you are.
beautifully, and I just wanted to amplify it for everyone. I'd love it if you could tell us, how are folks taking care of themselves, if at all, during this time, given the layers of violence that you're talking about? How are they taking
Yeah.
care of themselves and each other?
Before I answer that question, I also want to note that, there are folks who have been thinking about ways that incarceration, chronic illness, disability have been amplified in this crisis. But I want to note that there are several layers to the experience of violence and the experience of being targeted by the government when folks are both trans and disabled, when folks are both trans and living with HIV. The reality is that these are folks who have lives that are, multi-issue, that have experiences that have many layers. And I think it's really important to lift up those specific people, right? And I found that among the ways that organizations have responded to this, when there's a call about migration or incarceration, why isn't there a trans person present? Why isn't there a trans person who is formerly incarcerated present, right? There always needs to be a trans voice, no matter what issue or movement you're talking about. Trans people are spearheading solutions and are fierce leaders, and their leadership needs to be invested in, right? So I wanted to note that. And I also want to note that one thing that we've been falling back on is our resilience. Like, trans people have been relying on our interdependence since, decades, centuries ago, right? Trans people have always found ways to take care of each other, have always found ways to protect one another, house one another, be each other's families. There's documented history of that, right? Like, for example, in New York, within the ballroom community, that's a family that people had created when their own family shut them out. I want to lift up the legacy of Lorena Borjas, a trans Latinx elder who had passed away this month. She had she was famous for passing out condoms and protecting trans sex workers when they are regularly targeted by both civilians and the police. That's just one example of some of the ways that trans people take it upon themselves to protect one another.
Mm.
But I also, quite frankly, feel really sick. I feel sick of noting our resilience. I feel really tired of talking about how strong trans people are, because it's frankly not enough. I know that resilience lives in our DNA, but we shouldn't always have to depend on our resilience. Our communities should always be resourced,
Mhm.
supported, protected, and anything less than that is unacceptable.
I love that you're saying that because I often say specifically for like Black, Indigenous, other people of color, um, I often say that people highlight our resilience, but our resilience is coerced, and we
Mm,
shouldn't really need to be this tenacious. Someone else could be that tenacious. Someone else could be that resilience. Can we catch a break? That would be nice. You know what I mean? So I love you
right.
saying that, and I love you highlighting how trans communities have always been taking care of each other in different ways, right? Whether it be through ballrooms or just taking care of one another with condoms, loving up on one another. Um, and so creating communities and mutual aid has been led by people are talking about mutual aid right now when trans communities have always been doing mutual aid as a form of survival and livelihood, you know? And
Mhm.
I love you reminding us this. And I also, that's a, good segue for us to think through like, if we don't, trans communities don't have to continuously rely on their resilience. I think it's a time by which they can rely on non-trans folks, right? Everyone else in the world. So what can everyone else do to take care of our siblings?
Mm. Yeah, I'll just repeat first that trans people should always be among panelists for all of these virtual gatherings that folks are holding. Trans people should be part of these narrative strategies. People should turn to trans brilliance and trans wisdom because we have been not only dreaming up these different ways to depend on one another and create new futures, but we've actually been practicing it. People should be donating to these trans mutual aid funds. There's been many that have been created for undocumented trans folks, for Black trans folks, for trans people living in the South. And so people have been, trans folks have been doing these mutual aid practices for so long, right? But
Mm,
it's even more important now.
mm,
Um, I think the one thing that I always turn to when I get asked this question is the spiritual elements of what it looks like to show solidarity, right? In the long term, I really want people to see trans people and see a mirror to themselves and see a mirror to our society. If trans people are in pain, then that should tell you that this society is poisoned,
mm,
and no one should be content living in a poisoned world. For the sake of trans communities, for the sake of all people, and for the land, the waters, the sky, people need to allow a spiritual shift within themselves that accompanies a cultural shift within the world, right? We need to be living as if the future is already here because it is here.
mm,
Um, and so I really rely on um, the hope that each person can witness all the ways that trans brilliance has come forward in this time and look within themselves and see like how they can shift and change, and open themselves up to things that they may have feared before, because I think a lot of the barriers that people have to changing is because they fear that change and they're comfortable with normalcy, right?
mhm, mhm. And all the things that you're saying, all the things that you're reminding us, kind of helps me to think during this time in terms of supporting our trans communities. It's also about recognizing the power of our trans leaders, but also just our trans folks. Like there's so much power and depth and brilliance, but there's so much more that you're talking about. There's like something that blows everything up that is just phenomenal, right? And it is not to romanticize at all, right? Because folks are human, but also to recognize that power of being so dope. I think that that's what I think about, especially every time I get to see you and be around you. I'm just like, she is so amazing on so many levels. I wanted to see if you could tell us, we AAPA Women Lead has been saying that a lot of our work is always about, recognizing the leadership of self-identified women and girls, and we always say that it's in solidarity with other communities of color. Can you help us to define what that could look like or what that means for you?
Yeah, I think that the root of solidarity is shared struggle and a recognition that all liberation is intertwined.
Mm-hmm.
I think that when folks are practicing solidarity to be helpful or to lend a hand, that's all great. But I think that solidarity that actually moves us towards liberation is when folks see that their actions are part of a bigger picture and is beyond the interpersonal, right? That we're all adding collective action and vision in order to build this future that we all dream of and that we all deserve to live in. And so for me, I find that one of the issues that I recognize among Asian communities is this struggle to be seen, because for so long and still to this day, a lot of folks are not seeing themselves reflected in media, in art, in culture, and so on. And there's this craving, this hunger to be seen that is really real. And I don't dismiss that. And I also think that the problem, the second layer of that problem is that people don't realize that there are mirrors to themselves that have been present in the different ways that other communities of color have built their own foundations of art and culture and media, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, like when I see Black and Indigenous communities succeeding and, you know, creating their own hubs of culture and journalism and like storytelling, like that lifts me up as well. And I think that people need to recognize that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've been taught so much to silo ourselves, not just between identities, but to see ourselves as, to see the world as so scarce that we don't see how we benefit from when someone else succeeds, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think on a very basic level, if people recognize that more, they would be able to more easily see how solidarity can be practiced.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's super insightful and full of depth. One of the things that I feel like you are highlighting for us again is kind of the humility to be inspired and to learn from one another beyond ourselves, even in trying to figure out the specificity of what it means to be us, you know? So I love the idea of being inspired and learning as a part of a collective struggle for solidarity. And thank you for highlighting the issue of invisibility um, as well. So I think that's super important, and not to be confined by those. Like while we want to be seen, we also get to be seen alongside others. So
Exactly.
I have always, I was excited to learn from you when I saw you start to take kind of like stage more recently in kind of public stage. I was so excited to have you as someone to be inspired by. And I happen to be probably a couple decades older than you. So I wanted, and I say that because I was like, yes, 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 yes. Represent for me. You know what I mean? And I'm so grateful all the time to learn about your work as an organizer, as a writer. You're writing and you're organizing. You're doing so many things as a digital strategist. So multi-talented. If folks want to learn more about you, can you tell us where they can find you? Actually, not if. As people learn more about you and are excited to do so, please tell them where they can go and find more information.
Yeah, I definitely want folks to check out the work of Transgender Law Center. We've been doing really amazing work, um, challenging movements to include some of the most marginalized folks. We just started our disability project last end of last year, which I'm super excited about. So you can find that at transgenderlawcenter.org. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter as Trans Law Center. My own handles are Xoai.jpg on Instagram and Internet Xoai on Twitter. And Xoai is spelled Xoai. And then I also am a trans subject editor at Autostraddle. So I'm always looking for trans storytellers, especially new writers who are trying to develop their craft. So if you want to pitch me, you can pitch me at swai@autostraddle.com.
Yes. Perfect. You are so amazing. Thank you again for making time. I'm so happy that you were able to share your wisdom with us and your brilliance. Thank you so,
Thank you,
so much.
Jean.
Okay,
Thank you,
thank you. I
Kwani.
love you so much. Okay,
I love you.
okay.
Okay. Have a good rest of your day.
You too. Bye, babe.
Bye.